Morning to everybody, and firstly, an apology for last week where there was computer confusion due to matters beyond my control. But thanks to Jasmina, we are back to our normal state of affairs. Now, today's subject, which is about the flight of Jews, is a subject for absolutely everybody. I cannot imagine that there is any one of us that has not been the result of our grandparents, great grandparents, great great grandparents, or others having moved from one country to another. Being moving from one part of the world to another is part and parcel of the human story. How many of us could say that we haven't got roots in vast places around the world? And this is the story for today. Now, we've studied and looked at and followed the history, essentially through Europe, of the 19th century, where the Jews that we're talking about have aspired to be included and accepted as part and parcel in whichever nation they lived. If they wanted to be more German than the Germans, and more French than the French, and more English than the English, although England is not part of us, the recipients, but not part of this story. But even within the world where they wanted to be accepted, they never quite reached the ceiling. It was always a glass ceiling. They could see it, but they couldn't touch it. And as much as many people became accepted, it didn't quite work for the vast masses, for the millions of Jews who were living in Eastern Europe, for instance. And today, and next week, we'll be looking at how populations moved from one part of the world to the other. For the Jews, many of them felt that wherever they were, they needed to move on. They couldn't stay in the countries where they were because they were never going to be accepted. So they had two routes to be accepted, which we'll look at essentially. One was to be in America, and the other was then called Palestine, named by the Romans after the destruction of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the mid-2nd century. It was a new land of Israel, which had always been there and always been occupied by Jews. Now, if you look, for those of you that may have the sheet in front of you, and if you don't, it's very interesting to look at the movement of people. For we're not talking about a few people moving, we are talking about millions of people deciding to leave wherever they were living and move on. And there were Jews, for instance, even by 1840 or thereabout, 50,000 Jews who moved to Germany or from Germany, through Germany, and then out of Germany to places in America. But they were a small number. If you look at the map, the millions of people and the Jews' immigration into the United States was enormous. And it went year by year from 1881 onwards. There are the numbers in front of you there, and I don't expect you to count them, but there are somewhere near 1 million just in that period. And you can imagine today those numbers coming into a country. Now, America wasn't accepting Jews because they were just doing good for the Jews. America was inviting and accepting Jews because they were good for a country that was trying to have more people in it in order to expand its economy, in order to expand areas where they were basically completely backward. And this would apply to other countries such as South Africa, England, and others who needed people in their country. Now, the Jews were stable in Russia, what we would call today Russia, let's call it that in Eastern Europe, until the assassination of Alexander II in 1881. And 1881 would cause a new word to enter into the dictionary of pogrom, which comes from the Russian word like thunder. And this would cause the massacre as a result, not that the Jews were responsible for the assassination in 1881, but the Jews didn't need to be responsible to be blamed, and this would be part and parcel of their history. And suddenly there was a conference in 1882 of Jewish notables. The Jewish notables came together in order to discuss What do we do with the massive millions of Jews in Eastern Europe who could never be accepted, who aren't even in the position of the starting block of where the Jews are in Germany or in France? And the majority, vast majority, may have thought of emigration, but the reality was completely different. And they debated it between those who said we have to stay here in Russia and improve the conditions, and those who wanted to
Going
leave.
to expose myself now.
If
God.
you would mute yourself, please. Dr. George Price, who wrote a diary in 1882 and continued to write a diary all the way to his time in America, wrote what he thought, what he saw. He was one of the well-known personalities in the Jewish world, and he wrote a diary which he said about leaving Russia. Sympathy for Russia, how ironical it sounds. Am I not despised? Am I not urged to leave? Do I not hear the word Žid constantly? Can I even think that someone considers me a human being capable of thinking and feeling like others? Do I not rise daily with the fear lest a hungry mob attack me? It is impossible that a Jew should reject or regret leaving Russia. And that would have been my own grandparents who lived in Russia, Poland, who were compelled at around that period of the 1880s to get out and leave. Now they would leave what they would call the shtetl. Now the shtetl was not like Fiddle on the Roof. It wasn't a place where people enjoyed life, where they were always singing and going to weddings. Far from it. They were tended to be awful places where Jews lived in awful conditions. But there was an opportunity to go to what they had heard was America. And they spoke of America. Of course, they'd never seen it. They weren't in contact. Majority of people couldn't read. The majority of people never had any idea or met anybody who had gone to America, because anyone who went tended not to come back. So there's the other half of the story is told by Mary Antin, who came to America, as it says, 9 years after this Dr. Price, who is a man who wrote the diary. Said he, America was in everybody's mouth. Businessmen talked of it over their accounts. The market women made up their quarrels that they might discuss it from stool to stool. People who had relatives in the famous land went around reading their letters for the enlightenment of less fortunate folk. And remember, most people couldn't read, so they were getting others to read the letters for them, which came back. Children played at the game of emigrating. Old folks shook their heads over the evening fire and prophesied no good for those who braved the terrors of the sea and the foreign goals beyond it. All talked about it, but scarcely anyone knew one true fact about this magic land. Nobody really knew what America was like or America was about, but they just heard that it was the place you wanted to go to, where thousands, tens of thousands of Jews were going. And then there were reports coming back from America, reading below on the latest wave of emigration of 1891. Says it, with respect to the exodus of Jews from Russia, which has normally or recently gained in momentum, the following appeared in a Russian journal. And from the hundreds and from the husbands and fathers in America came letters full of moans and wails about their bitter lot in the new country. For they soon realized there is no chance of success. It is difficult to find work, and their pay is sufficient only to buy themselves a few crusts of bread. How then could they save even a penny to send home to their families? Remembering, and if you've seen the film Hester Street, which is a wonderful film and explains much of what we're talking about, and I can only but recommend it, that there the man would often go over to whichever land they were going to, whether it was South Africa or England or America, and they would then say they were going to save money and send back the money in order to get their wives and children over from Russia to this new land. But how could they even save even a penny to send home to their families? Those who leave yearn with all their hearts to return to their homeland, but are unable, so there were those who wanted to go back, to find the money for the journey. And there, of course, are many thousands of cases, literally, and what the rabbis dealt with as well, in the situation of where many men went over to America and simply disappeared. They had no intention of ever sending back the money to Eastern Europe for their wife and children to come over. They simply were going to start a new and exciting life. Now, traveling today is relatively easy, even if you go Ryanair or EasyJet. However, those in those days, can you imagine you are traveling from a shtetl or a part of Russia? You've never traveled half a dozen miles from where you live. You have never experienced a life other than what you have imbibed. You have never moved into a non-Jewish world. You have never been on any major form of transport. And suddenly you are going to be getting up in your millions of people and moving from Russia or Poland or Romania or Austria-Hungary in order to get to the Goldene Medina, to the great new land, which is going to, of course, be paved with gold. And they would, in the main, all our ancestors would travel by train via either Berlin or Brody, which was a favorite spot in Austria. And there it would be decided, there people were going, if they came from Lithuania, they were going to different parts of the world, and they were going towards South Africa. But here I'm talking about the Western, the ones who would go off to America. And they would go from or to Bremen in Germany, or Amsterdam, Rotterdam in Holland, or they would go to Antwerp in Belgium. And they would be aided. Now, while the majority of Western Jews did not, as it were, want to be living next to the type of Jews who were coming out of Eastern Europe, being part of the Jewish world, they would support them financially. They didn't want to live with them. They wouldn't really want to see them, and they didn't want to be embarrassed by them. But it didn't mean that they didn't feel they were fellow Jews and they would do much to help them, because they weren't moving to places which would give them facilities and money. They had to be provided for. And one of the major contributors to the financial wherewithal of the Jews was Baron Maurice de Hirsch, and he was one of the wealthiest Jews of the time and a philanthropist. And the other was the Alliance Israélite Universelle, an organization set up to fight anti-Semitism, but would also help poor Jews moving through Europe. The numbers moving through Europe were enormous. Enormous. You think of today, but then their numbers were far greater. So that in 1882, if you lived in Brody, the population of Brody at the time in 1882 was 15,000, but the number of Jewish refugees in Brody at that time were 20,000. They completely swamped the local population, Jews or others. And the Germans, or those arriving into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, those coming through into Germany, feared the plague. So reading just below, this is what people feared. The German authorities on the sheet 1880 to 1890. In a great lonely field, opposite a solitary house within a large yard, our train pulled up at last, and a conductor hurried us into one large room. Here a great many men and women dressed in white received us. This was the medical facilities which they provided either here in Europe or there in America. But here, this is in Germany. Another sense of bewildering confusion. People who've never traveled. Parents losing their children and little ones crying. Those white-clad Germans shouting command, always accompanied with schnell, schnell. The confused passengers obeying all orders like meek children. Our things were taken away. Our friends separated from us. A man came to inspect us as if to ascertain our full value, like the slave market. Strange-looking people driving us about like dumb animals. Children we could not see crying in a way that suggested terrible things. Ourselves driven into a little room where a great kettle was boiling on a little stove. Our clothes were taken off, our bodies rubbed with slippery substance. A shower of warm water came down on us without warning. For when they came into Germany and other parts, Austria-Hungary as well, Brody, one thing they feared is that the Eastern Europeans carried the plague, some form of disease. And at all the ports, there were more inspections. And the inspections were really important, and they weren't there at first. Because if any of the Jews, the immigrants, arrived into America, into New York, and were found to be diseased, they were sent back to where they come from. They were not accepted in America. They only took in the people they wanted. And if you had a disease, you were sent back. And the people who had to pay for them being sent back were the boat and the shipping companies that had taken them over in the first place. So it was the interest, therefore, to get all the doctors and all the facilities and all the nurses into Europe so that they didn't actually get onto the ships in order that they wouldn't be rejected when they arrived at Ellis Island. Now, the cost to go from Bremen to New York at that time was $33.50. And you could pay an extra $17 to bribe the officials. Without bribing officials at the borders and other places, it would be exceedingly difficult to move through Russia to Germany to get onto a ship. The conditions of the boats at that time were absolutely awful. Anything you can imagine, it was even worse than that. People were stinking, the ships were stinking, the holds were without air and were stinking. People arrived to America penniless, starving, and exhausted. And they arrived at Ellis Island, which was not the first place. In fact, the first place that immigrants arrived was a place called Castle Garden, which was replaced by 1892. But continued to see people all the way to 1924 and was even being used during the period of the Second World War. And the Jews arrived at a rate on Ellis Island of about 15,000 people a day. And many of the Jews arriving thought it was like the Day of Judgment as they went through from one doctor to the next, to the next. People didn't speak the language. People were totally and absolutely full of anxiety and panic. And they were concerned as to whether they would be allowed to enter or not. There were dozens of lines with inspectors. First, the doctor examined them, and immediately 20% of those that arrived would possibly be rejected. Everybody's clothes was marked with an H, which meant you had a heart problem, with a K if you had a hernia, with a SC if you had scalp problems, and an X if you had mental deficiency. And an interpreter would ask to see the Jewish disease, as they called it, of TB. They then went on, if you survived that, or the 80% that survived that inspection, you then went on to a second doctor who would examine you for leprosy or sexually transmitted diseases. And then you would go on to the third doctor, who was the most feared. For in those days, eye disease was a major contributor to the diseases which affected people. It was absolutely terrifying to see if people had trachoma. And if yes, they were rejected. No one would be accepted with trachoma. No one. And in the lines they were building out, they were according to nationality and not religion. And more questions were asked, and gradually the immigrants learnt to know what the answer should be. When they arrived there in Ellis Island, there were different societies to help them. No Jew was to be without help of fellow Jews and others who would help them in that way. There was no state giving of finances. There was the Immigrant and Aid Society. There was HIAS, a Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. There was a Hachnosas Orchin. There was HIAS, an organization aiding immigrants once in New York and Ellis Island, and then going all the way over to the ports in Germany. The Jews who came left hunger and persecution in Russia to the warmth of what they expected was to be America. But the warmth and familiarity of the shtetl was gone. They often came over with no family. They were overwhelmingly young, and many worked in the clothing industry. They were poor, unwashed, and peripheral to society. And then more would come over in a second wave. Rabbis would come over, more religious. Bundists would come over, those politically aware, into America. The Lower East Side, where many of our family may have come, I do believe my mother's or grandmother's family somehow went to America and left it because they viewed America as being trafe, just not the sort of place where you wanted to live, and came back all the way to England. Now, especially on the Lower East Side, around Orchard Street, there used to be around 522 people per acre. After 1900, they were now living 700 people per acre. And the worst parts of it were considered worse than Bombay at that time. There was stench. The people were awful and dirty. The buildings were awful. They were alien, noisy, grey. There was disorientation. There was a loss of roots. There was a loss of religion. Many, in fact, the majority gave up religion because if you needed to work, you needed to work on a Saturday. And if you needed to survive, you had to work on a Saturday. So they gave up. And so many of those who came, if you see again in the film Hester Street, you come over as a religious Jew and you end up as an unwashed, irreligious Jew in America. Now, really on the sheet, the Lower East Side of the 90s, the Yiddish writer, Kobrin, states he, a grey stone world of tall tenements, where even on the loveliest spring day, there wasn't a single blade of grass. The streets are enveloped in an undefinable atmosphere, which reflects the unique light or shadow of its Jewish inhabitants. The air itself seemed to absorb the unique Jewish sorrow and pain, an emanation of its thousands of years of exile. The sun, grey and depressed, the men and women clustered around pushcarts, the grey walls of the tenements, all looked sad. And the word sad, in a way, was the overwhelming word which summed up what life was like in the Goldene Medina, in the new golden world where the pavements were not paved with gold. The idyllic view of the shtetl still existed, and in 1882, around 29% of those who went to America returned to Eastern Europe. Of just of 1881, that's about 3,000 people, as portrayed again in many of the Hollywood films. The daily life was anti-religious. There was a parody on the Talmud statement that three things are important in the world: Torah, Avodah, service, and Gemilah Chasadim, doing good deeds. And the new quote in the New World was, the New World stands on three things: money, money, and again money. Because without some form of money, there was absolutely no hope at all. The lost souls of the 1880s and the 1890s worked all hours, often working 60 hours a week in awful tenements, peddling garments. Of 90% of the Jews in New York worked in the garment industry. And to the fatalists, it was just another example of Jewish fate, where it had been awful, it was continuing to be awful. Many simply disappeared and went under. They were nameless, they were unremembered, and they never called for their families. And there were women left in Eastern Europe completely alone, not knowing what happened to their husbands. Everybody, this family simply disappeared. Now, the community was essentially secular. Just look at the piece down, the east side, where we'll end. On the one hand, we have a 3-year-old child helping its mother to fix trimmings because even 3-year-old children had to work. In the home, never out of sight, always where the mother could attend to its wants and allay its fears and suffering. While on the other hand, we see the mother compelled to desert her 3 little ones of tender years, going out to the shop to work, because the law prohibits her bringing the work to home. As a result, these unfortunate little ones are left alone in a tenement, shut up in a fireless room with no one to attend their wants. Now, those who did fire, there were famous fires which took place, killing many people at different times. But to see how far they were from religion, notice the anarchists, Jewish anarchists, had called at the Brooklyn Labor Lyceum on Myrtle Avenue the Grand Yom Kippur Ball, whilst you would have gone in the shtetl on Kol Nidre night to prayers and in your synagogues. Here we have in New York a Grand Yom Kippur Ball with theatre, arranged with the consent of all the new rabbis of liberty. Kol Nidre, night and day, you were invited to in the year 5651 after the invention of the Jewish idols, and in the year 1890 after the birth of the false Messiah. The Kol Nidre will be offered by John Most, music, dancing, buffet, basses, and other hymns against Satan. So this is what you were invited to, and this is what many Jews who had in Eastern Europe been part of the Jewish world with a certain amount of religion now dissipated into this sort of environment. But despite the physical hardships, despite the social awfulness, despite the unbelievable competition there was just to survive, Jews kept coming. And by 1914, over 2 million Jews had left Eastern Europe in order to go to America. The population in Eastern Europe of Jews did not decline, because as many as were leaving, there were more being born. But there were those who believed in staying in Russia and working towards what they believed would be a socialist utopia. There was Marxism, there was anarchy, there was social democracy, and they would replace this idea, and they formed what was known, we won't go into it here, into the Bund, with a class struggle in order to help the Jews stay in Russia, stay in Eastern Europe, and improve it. But there were others that said, if not America, where are we going to go? They came to England sometimes by mistake. It was actually, in some ways, if you look at the records, it was more expensive to come to England than it was to go all the way to America, for reasons beyond my economic wherewithal. But if you weren't going to go to America, and you weren't going to go to South Africa, and you weren't going to go to Western Europe, then where were you going to go? And at that time, a new word was coined by Nathan Birnbaum in 1890, and that was the word Zionism. And that is where we shall leave it for next week. And I wish you, everybody, a very good day. And you can now go back and look at your family photographs of your own histories.